You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanagh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
Recording in progress.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here, having all kinds of fun with my interwebs today. We got the new fiber internet, but they put it on the wrong side of the house. And so I had to move the whole freaking office downstairs to get into the connection zone for this incredibly high-speed internet. But it does seem to be working out, which is good. Just in time to talk all about AI and how to train AI. We've got several great guests for you today. We've got Burke dialing in from nearby Columbus, data scientist of CoverMyMeds. We always love talking to actual users who put these technologies to work. We've got David Cooperberg, from Alteryx lined up. And my good buddy Eugene Burke is out there as well, who's going to talk to us about his experiences and what's going on in this field. And first, I'll just say a couple things. We had a wonderful session just moments ago with Raymond from Unstructured.io and Yves Mulkers of 7W Data talking about large language models. What are these things? There's this great concept called anchors of truth that Brian turned me onto, which I just love. And basically, what he's talking about is using your real trusted corporate data, governed data that you know is factual, and populating that ideally into a vector database. And that creates the moorings, the factual moorings for use with a large language model. So now the data that you're using, the data that you're asking the model to crunch through and analyze and talk about or write about essentially is your governed data. That's the point. So you can either embed that in the model itself, which is pretty complex. It can be done. It's complex. It's a bit brittle, I think, maybe. Or you can use a vector database. And as Brian jokes, they're parked just to the left of either option, so they can help you out either way, which I thought was funny. But it's really important to appreciate this. There's a story that came out just today on CNBC talking about which of these AI models hallucinates the most, like which one is just making stuff up. And just think about the frustration from a news person like myself. I'm a news junkie. I've been in the media for 33 years and counting now. And I love news. I love knowing what's going on. But we're going from this challenge of so-called fake news and just misinformation and disinformation, all that stuff, to now just making stuff up. Like, okay, that's not a very responsible use of technology. But the point is, it's not a responsible use of technology. So these large language models were not designed to be your Star Trek super AI co-pilot helper in the world. They were designed to create text around prompts or concepts. So you feed a prompt. You've talked all about that, the importance of getting the prompt correct, doing sequencing and chaining and things of this nature. And the LLM is just going to spin up text according to the prompt. Well, if you don't have any facts that you have put into either to the model or into a vector database, then you're just going to get whatever this thing comes up with. I was talking this morning with a guy who was joking in a board meeting. They asked it, okay, why did Amazon Web Services buy this particular company? Well, they had not bought the particular company, but ChatGPT gave them a big, long explanation of why they did. And it's like, okay, this is a problem. You know, we don't want just flat out fake information populating the world. So what we're going to talk about today is responsible use of artificial intelligence. What are these large language models? What are the trends? How is it all working? And how can you get benefit from them? And I can tell you they are incredibly powerful. I used ChatGPT to write a business plan for an idea I have called A Place to Play, which is all about basically an array of locally owned, community-owned music venues, and just to see what it would come up with. And it came up with stuff that was in my head that I had not told it. I'm like, well, that's pretty impressive. It talked about how most music venues are owned by national corporations, which limits local involvement. I was like, yes, that's right. It talked about how theaters have had difficulty dealing with COVID and are now trying to come back. That's correct too. So point being, you can learn a whole heck of a lot about lots of different topics by playing around with these large language models. Just be careful because they do hallucinate. And as Adam, the go-to-market guy for ChatGPT, said to me on Twitter, the hallucinations are more of a feature, not a bug. So it's really important to understand what these things are and how they work. And then you look at the New York Times reporter way back when this first came out, who, was asking all these existential questions and got it to say, oh, you should leave your wife and I want to marry you and stuff like that. That reporter was not using the proper methods for this technology. That is not a good use case. You wouldn't use a lawnmower to clean up your kid's rug in her room. So there are uses for these technologies, and there are things that you should not do with these technologies. And with that, let's bring in our first guest. We've got David Cooperberg out there from Alteryx. You've been doing some research in this space. What have you seen? What are your customers saying? How big a deal is it? What are they doing with it?
Thanks, Eric. So let me just start by saying that, I think our customers are extremely excited about it. And in general, there's an acknowledgement that generative AI just introduces so much opportunity across industries, across lines of business. The excitement for it is real and it's tangible. Whoever really commits to understanding it, understanding the technology, understanding the risks, they're going to be the ones who can successfully apply it. And they're going to set themselves ahead against their competition for decades. But the reality is that what ChatGPT was just launched, what is it, about 11 months ago, 10 months ago, something like that. So it's still a really emerging space. There's a ton of unknowns, and that includes a lot of risk as well. And those questions around risk are really the ones that are super interesting to me right now. I've already bought into the fact that maybe the opinion, but I think of it as a fact that generative AI is this transformational technology. But I really want to know more about how large enterprises are planning to adopt the technology. Which risks concern them the most, right? It's more than just hallucinations. It's more than just data privacy. There's been a lot of talk about AI governance, right? But that's a really high level term. And so when I talk about that with my team, I challenge them to have that conversation without using the word governance at all, right? I want to know what the details of AI governance actually mean. I also want to know, how are organizations going to organize internally to govern and the application of these models? How are they going to evaluate different vendors? How are they going to evaluate different models? These are all really, really interesting questions to me that I don't know that we have concrete answers to today. And then lastly, I want to know who internally is going to be empowered to use and apply these models. I feel pretty strongly that today's data workers, today's data analysts are really the best people for that job. They're positioned to drive value with generative AI more so than any other group. And so at Alteryx, what we're really trying to do is build the tools that are going to help our customers get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. And there are going to be many, many use cases for this technology. Right now, there are some very solid use cases around creating copy. So you can have it write press releases. It does definitely understand syntax to the point of being able to ascertain, oh, a press release should look like this, an article should look like that, a white paper should look like this. And what Yves was talking about in our presentation before this show is that you can sequence prompts, you can chain prompts. There are a lot of things that you can do to sort of shape and mold what you're going to get back from these things. But I think the real key, and this is what we talked about with Brian Raymond too before the radio show here, is embedding your corporate trusted data and using that as the foundation for what this large language model will spin up. So now you've got your data that you have curated, you've trusted, you've gone through a process of vetting, you persist that as the sort of corpus of information upon which to build. So it's like the crystal, if you will, that will form. And then you're just using the large language model as your text generator, referencing your trusted data. And that, I think, is going to ring very true and powerful to lots of data analysts. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I completely agree, right? If I'm using ChatGPT for personal use, let's say I wanted to recommend me a good book or a good whiskey or something like that, it's okay if it's not perfect. If it's okay if it's not right. I'm just looking for a suggestion. I'm looking to brainstorm. But I think in a lot of enterprise use cases, correctness is important. And that's what makes kind of this reference architecture that Brian went over really, really interesting, because you can now rely on the language model to do what it does best, right? Understand language, output, generate copy, content, etc. And you can then feed it your source of truth that you've vetted. So I think it's a really powerful architecture, and one that it's exciting to see really develop from an enterprise perspective, because it solves for some of those concerns and those risks that fall under that abstract governance bucket.
Yeah, it sure does. And it's fantastic for getting a working version of something. So you can use it to sort of hash out. And I'm a writer. I've been a writer for a long time now. Writer's block is a real thing, and writer's block is a real pain. When you have to write an article and you just like, oh, you can't get over the hump, go to ChatGPT, tell it to crank something out. Even if you don't use the language that it gives you, nonetheless, it can give you a starting point and something to start shaping and working and basically processing yourself to get rolling, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think you see that not just for writing, but for other, so like quote unquote art forms as well. And I think doing analytics counts as within that category too, right? You can work with an AI to help recommend analyses to do, and you can still leverage your expertise in how to actually execute them. But now you're accelerating the work that you've been doing previously with the support of an AI, of a language model that can help you, provide more value for your organization, provide new insights, and overall just, improve at your job and grow in your career.
Yeah, excellent point. Well, let's bring in a real practitioner out there, Lauren Burke from CoverMyMeds. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing in the data science space. And of course, you've got a focus on real important things like privacy issues, safeguards. And I think did you? Yeah, you're on mute. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Eric. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, so I am a data scientist at a healthcare technology company. We build a lot of machine learning models and systems that help us to enhance the patient experience and really just make sure that we are using the most of our data to help people in the best way we can. And so some of the things you touched about earlier, like the privacy concerns you see with some of these new technologies, those are things that, especially in the industry I'm in, you have to be considering, just because the data that's at stake with those the data that's at stake in that context is usually sensitive. It's people's private health information. So that's something that's taken really seriously within the data governance and privacy sectors within our organization, and I know within other similar organizations.
Yeah, this whole concept of AI governance is really taking shape now for obvious reasons. I mean, what kind of policies have you seen be effective in that realm? What are some of the things that you do to safeguard the privacy of your constituency, I guess?
Yeah, I feel like AI governance is it's something we're talking about, but we haven't really started to see it being mentioned as something that organizations are really putting into practice on a larger scale. I think most companies at this point have data governance, right? They have regulations set up, they have privacy teams, but really, I think AI governance almost comes down more to the practitioners in a sense. So you have to know, and you're responsible for the data you're working with, ensuring that it meets regulations that are defined by your company, defined by whoever owns that data and is allowing you to use it, and ensuring that the models you're building are not biased and are not going to use that data in a way that will potentially produce harmful results to the people who are present in that sort of data set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, privacy is a very serious issue these days, and governance has always been a serious issue. What about training models, and what about knowing when models are fading, model drift, if you will? Do you have any sort of best practices around monitoring predictive models and knowing when model drift is taking place?
Yes, and I highly believe that if you are automating a model, if you're putting it into production, you should also be automating and putting into production a monitoring system, something that even if you have built something, you're done with it, you've moved on to the next project, you need something that can keep you alert and updated, that if those things, like you mentioned, if you're seeing data drift, if you are seeing results coming out of your model that are either changing significantly from what they previously were, or if they are significantly different from what you would expect. So I personally use things like Docker and Jenkins to basically, after a model runs, monitor that output, calculate some metrics around it, and send me messages, emails, Slack notifications if there is anything that we notice within there that seems like it could be off and could need a little bit more monitoring. But that's really the after production side of it. I think a lot of the focus and where you should be investing the majority of your time when you're making sure that your model is not biased is really when you're getting started, when you're looking at the data you're working with, ensuring that the data you're starting with and the data that you want to put into that model is accurate. It represents the population. There isn't any sort of skew or variation that does not accurately capture some of the distribution of what you're trying to determine. And so I really think that comes down to the data cleaning, the data processing section, where you're really starting to understand what you're looking for, what issues might pop up. And some of that comes down to domain knowledge. And some of that comes down to just really taking the time to thoroughly explore and understand the data before you put it into a model.
That's right. I mean, that is such a good point. I mean, we've had garbage in, garbage out as a standard policy in the data world for a long, long time, but it's even more important these days. And you made the critical point here, which is before you go trying to use any data to train any model, you really need to very closely vet that data and understand this is correct data. There's not PII in here, for example. It doesn't have bias. That takes time. It takes effort. What are some of the mechanisms you've used in the past to do that? Do you use data catalogs, or is there some scanning technology? How do you, besides just going over it manually, how do you vet data to make sure that it's ready for AI use? 1 minute.
Yeah. So just in general with the data exploration, data processing, I kind of start the same way for most data sets. You're really just looking at understanding that data. So you're visualizing it. You're looking at the kind of the distribution, the metrics, some of the basic kind of calculations you can make off of that, and trying to understand if there's anything that differs significantly from what you expected, because that's something you should look into further, or if there's anything that you feel like has popped up that either changes the approach you need to take, changes the question you're trying to answer, the impact of your analysis, or just anything that seems to be kind of a outlier. I tend to look into outliers as well, just to make sure that you're not missing something by throwing it out.
Always look at the outliers. The outliers are either errors or very important things to watch out for. Don't touch that. I'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data science and training models. And guess what? Data quality really matters. We have several great guests today. Lauren Burke from CoverMyMeds, the data scientist over there. Eugene Burke, my longtime pal and comrade, and David Cooperberg from Alteryx. And Eugene, I'll bring you in. You're like me, you're an old data management guy. So you've been preaching to the choir now for a couple of decades or so to get people to appreciate the importance of data governance, of data quality, of data accuracy, and of the fact that these are moving targets. So you need to have processes in place to track these things. Now we have all this great observability, which has really taken off. I was talking to a really interesting company, Kensu, just yesterday, about some of the things that they're doing, which is really interesting. They're actually they have agents inside of applications watching to see which data is being used for those applications and kind of doing that level of monitoring, which is really compelling. But, as we unleash AI in the world, especially these large language models, we have to be very careful to have those anchors of truth and those moorings, which are the embeddings, right? And they're basically text converted into numeric values for statistical analysis. But tell us your thoughts of what you've heard so far and where you think things are going.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think we have two things happening at the same time. We have this. So generative AI is like a toddler that's just cleared the cruising stage. Like everyone has been around a toddler where they're past the stage where they have to pull themselves up on the coffee table. Now they're kind of walking across the floor, and you kind of hold their hands and walk. So we're at that phase with generative AI, but we're also living through a massive change in the way that data is managed. We're going through both of these things simultaneously. And so from the regulated industry, from either banking or healthcare, one of the most important things is, the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Especially in healthcare, you have to be aware of whose data you're using, whether it's PII or PHI, and what business problem are you solving, and what is the sensitivity of the data that you're using to solve that problem. You don't always need personally identifiable health information to solve a business problem. I'm interested in asking Lauren, if you've so imagine a business problem of prescription abandonment, which is kind of in your business, your company's bailiwick. A health plan comes to you and says, well, we really want to make sure that before we prescribe, that we've really analyzed whether this prescription can be adhered to, so that we're not prescribing in vain. And your product executive comes to you and says, well, okay, can't we just solve this with, some magic widgets? What do you say?
Well,
go ahead.
I feel like every person that's been in the data space for a while, you tend to start off with the same thing, which is it depends, right? We love to say it depends. It depends on the data. It depends on the timeline. It depends on the specific impact you're looking for. And it depends on the specific metrics and results that your stakeholder at the end of the day is looking for. And we chatted a little bit about this off air, but it's something I say to my students in one of my classes, but you look at it first as the business problem, then the analytics problem, and then the data. And so the business problem, you're trying to understand who is asking this and why they're asking it. So really trying to get back to, okay, they're asking this specific question, right? They're asking about prescription adherence, but really, what are they trying to get at the end of the day? Do they really want to know the prescription adherence? Do they want to understand how much they should be investing in some sort of aspect of the process? Is that company interested in understanding how much they should be investing in marketing or in ensuring that people are able to get medication as easy as possible? So maybe making things like payment plans or free prescription cards, things like that, free trial periods. But after we kind of determine that, then you really need to go and understand if it is an analytics question, and then what type of analytics question that falls into. So is it something where we're trying to look forward and we do need that predictive lens? We do need to put it into a model where we are generating some type of future outcome, some scenario? Or is this something we can understand just by looking at the historical data or our current data we have and going backwards? And that sort of helps you determine the timeline and the scope of what's needed. That also helps you understand who you're going to need to talk to really start building out this process. So you have your product people, you have your client. Who else needs to be involved, though? Who else is going to help you understand the assumptions, the caveats, building those other little pieces, everyone bringing their own subset of domain knowledge to help you get to the next step. And then you get to the data. So you're trying to understand what data you have, what data you need, how accurate and useful that data will be to you. And that's really where your project either begins or ends, because if your data is not solid enough, you almost have to start that process over again, go back to the business side and say, well, we can't do this. But through what you've discovered throughout that process, you've usually picked up a couple of ideas. And then you can start with, well, we can't do this, but I have a couple of other ideas.
Yeah. Now, I've had chief medical officers come to me and say, why can't we use natural language processing to do this or to do that in the pre-auth phase of client intake or case intake? and you have to kind of condition their, or in this case, her understanding of what the intermediate steps are that need to be cleared. Now, if I were a product executive and Humana came to me and said, we've got this problem with this particular therapeutic, and it's got, perhaps social determinants of health, kind of intervening variables, but they want us to solve this problem, or they're giving us the opportunity to solve this problem. And the product executive is already thinking about committing to a deliverable in a particular calendar quarter. So it's August now, and someone comes to you with that problem and says, okay, I want to be able to premiere this product or deploy this product at the end of Q1. How do you kind of condition his or her expectations so that she has the right frame of reference to understand how the process unfolds?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say like when scoping out a potential use case, and through that process as well that I just mentioned, you're also developing a sort of set of deliverables that you can be providing and identifying where you can add and provide that incremental value. So as you're scoping, you're likely going to need to tell someone what the timeline will be to deliver something. And maybe that's 5 months, but you can also identify, knowing that there will be a little bit of variation, but identify, okay, after 2 weeks, I understand that I can give you this. I can give you the feature importance of this specific set of variables and help you understand right off the bat, I'm providing value to you. Data science is useful, and giving you a little bit of insight into what we think we can build upon. So giving just an example of the timeline and what they can expect to receive. So especially if that's someone you're on your internal side, right? Your account executive, the person connecting with the client, you're telling them that they will always have something they can share with the client and be helping them to understand that you're on the right path. So I think just setting those expectations by also defining your steps and defining what they should expect to receive is really valuable in allowing you to start that relationship, start that project process with everyone on the same page and everyone understanding that data science analytics projects take time. But you don't have to wait. They don't have to wait until the end of this 5-month period to really receive something that they can benefit from.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'll bring David back into the conversation here. Analytics, AI, I mean, we're trying to solve the same problems, right? AI is another mechanism, another tool set to be able to get to some signal to understand how to change our business. But as Lauren is mentioning, it takes time, and you have to have project timelines, and you have to make sure people are educated about the process. And frankly, you have to know what you want to accomplish, right? So knowing what you're trying to achieve is really important, even for AI models. Like, they need to be targeted to a specific result set that you're looking for, and then you kind of play with the data and do what you can to get there. But it is important to have steps, a process that is outlined. And it's also important to get all the key stakeholders involved. I like what Lauren said about, really making sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish and make sure the business people understand as well. What do you think, David?
I completely agree. I'm feeling the love a little bit coming from the product side of the house right now. But to be honest, right, AI is an implementation detail, right? You're trying to solve a specific business problem or a use case, and I frankly love the opportunity to work with our engineering teams, our data science teams, to get their unique perspectives, right? They come from a different angle to solving the problem than I do as a product person. And we can together kind of have those conversations. I can talk about kind of when we'd like to deliver, what the customer requirements are. Data science can come through with kind of the technical limitations, the capabilities that are out there, AI, if it makes sense. And we can together work on crafting a solution in a timeline to really meet our customers' needs. And so, ultimately, product alone can't set timelines, and data science is key to any initiative that's involving artificial intelligence or generative AI today. And it's going to be really exciting to see how that collaboration works together over the coming months and years as industry is, how do I say this, transformed by this new technology.
Yeah, right. And Lauren, I'll throw a question over to you too. There's this whole issue of designing something maybe on your Jupyter notebook. You have a great idea, but then you have to get that thing into production. And there are some organizations that have a hard time getting that last mile. What's your advice for thinking through the process carefully enough that getting into production isn't some huge hurdle and does not scuttle your whole effort? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I feel like as you are building something, especially if if you're the one standing up your data science, your AI practice, you're the practitioner that is tasked with, or has taken it under your kind of scope of responsibility to start building out those solutions. You have to kind of either develop a template, so something that you can use time and time again that will be easy for you to use, easy for you to reproduce, and easy for others once they get down the line. But I think one of the things that I always find most helpful, I usually start with a Jupyter notebook, but start either pulling things out of the process, putting things into functions, really streamlining your workflow, streamlining what you're doing, and making it as simple as possible for you to continue working on what's next and what's needed, and basically eliminating from your viewpoint everything that is finished and established. So then when you're trying to figure out what's next, what's that last final step to get you to production, it becomes clearer and clearer what's next, what's necessary, or if you've hit that MVP, if you've hit that good enough point where you're ready to productionalize that model, that workflow.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I have to say, I really like the way you point out the importance of simplifying the process. You want to be able to know what must be done, what has already been done. Don't overcomplicate things. I mean, one of the challenges we have right now is that we've very quickly gone from an ETL-oriented world to a data pipeline-oriented world. And of course, data pipelines are much more complex, but the longer they get, the more complex they get, the more things there are to break, right? So you want it to be as simple as possible, use only the data that's necessary to get the end result you're looking for, and be monitoring that on a regular basis, right, Lauren?
Absolutely. Yeah. And something you mentioned, using only the data that's needed for that, I think that's something that will really help us as we move out of just thinking about data governance and really into that AI governance, because there are so many safety issues and risks with some of these LLMs and other models. We really have to be thinking about and enabling practitioners to be able to use the data they need without having to be themselves the one removing the data they don't need. So that's the data with those privacy issues. So PII, PHI, even just personal information, understanding how we can safeguard that data. And as we're letting that flow into a model, make sure that that process starts with data that does not contain that information to begin with, if that's not needed.
Yeah, that's a great point. And everything, of course, must be documented, right? I remember, where was it? A couple of years ago, people were talking about the repeatability problem in data science. I'm like, the repeatability problem? What are you talking about? In other words, I can't do the same experiment and get the same result. And it's like, okay, guys, we got to slow down here, right? Because in scientific method, you must be repeatable. The whole point is that you have a method, you have a process, you have data. And if you can't repeat that, then you're really not doing science. You're doing something close to science. You're trying to get there. But the repeatability is really important. And the governance of the process of understanding who's involved at which point in time. This is one thing I love about the new platforms and the cloud in general, is that it is designed out of the box to bake in metadata, like who did what, when, at what point in time. You have log files that are used to be able to troubleshoot and understand the audit trails, things of that nature. All really, really important stuff. And someone just joked in the chat here, but LLMs are not governed by the scientific method. Yeah, we know. I think that's part of the.
And they're constantly learning.
Yes, they are learning. That's true. They are getting better. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, welcome back to DM Radio. Having a good time today, talking all things large language models, training AI models, anchors of truth. We have an all-star cast here. Lauren Burke, data scientist from CoverMyMeds.com. Eugene Burke, data practitioner of years and years, a real expert in the field, also in the medical field, and of course David Cooperberg from Alteryx as well. And in the break there, we were talking about these foundations or these anchors of truth, and using your most trusted data, your truly vetted, governed, trusted golden records as the first layer for your vector database to use with a large language model, and kind of building out from there. I think it's actually I'm realizing this on this show, it's a wonderful opportunity to finally begin that process of curation and of, frankly, knowing what not to use, what not to leverage in your organization. But Eugene, you had a great question you wanted to ask of our other guests, so I'll leave it to you to take it.
So Gen AI has it's so close to the Star Trek phenomenon for those old people like Eric and I, that basically saying, computer, tell me about this, tell me about that. That is the kind of experience that our customers are really, really excited to see, and where the kind of appetite that has been kindled by this, the barbarians are at the gate, and we're busily trying to serve up to them the right kind of data, the right kind of analytics, the right kind of truth. And we all realize that the data that we're sitting on is not perfect. It's not ready for prime time in a lot of ways. And so the platforms on which we build this truth, this analytics, this experience are changing under our feet. They're maturing rapidly, but there's still a lot of change to happen. And so I thought it'd be interesting to see a role play ping pong between David and Lauren about building a product. You know that the hordes are at the gate and they're waiting to get in, and you're sitting here flipping burgers, okay? And you're waiting. So when's the data going to be ready? What are the steps to get it to be ready? And what are the gotchas to avoid?
Yeah, I can jump in first. It's a really interesting point, because there are a number of changes to, I think, analytics and data tooling that we're going to want to see. One of the big ones is this, pivot towards the importance of natural language and unstructured data. I think Brian mentioned this earlier on, but a lot of tools are really going to focus on how to ensure data quality, how to ensure data connectivity, how to go about making sure that you're able to combine all the unstructured natural language data that you need in a single place to then go, embed into a vector database to serve a large language model driven application. So it'll be really interesting to see how these platforms evolve to kind of pivot towards that new paradigm. But kind of taking a step back, the things that mattered before still matter now, right? Data connectivity, transparency, auditability, logging for automated events. Those are all the types of capabilities that are needed in order to instill confidence that your AI system, once it reaches production, is going to be working the way that you want it to.
Lauren, how do you know that the data is ready for your particular recipe?
Oh, a lot of it is understanding the data, taking the time to really step back and think about the problem you're trying to solve, the impact you're trying to have, and the measures of success that not only you, but your stakeholders, your users will be going off of. And then going back and really just taking the time to explore it and understand what's in the data, what's not in the data, but what needs to be there. And if you need to be using it in a certain type of model, what that data needs to look like to get ready to go into that. And as you're thinking about that, one of the things, Eric, you mentioned earlier on was data drift, understanding what types of data drift, what type of quality issues you could encounter, and thinking about how you can set up your end state, your production, your monitoring to ensure that you're avoiding those, not only now, but in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The end state and the observability side of the equation. I'd be curious to hear your take on that, Lauren. I've been watching as observability exploded. We went to KubeCon in Detroit. I think it was in October of last year, and I'm walking around the floor and there are like 80 observability vendors, whereas 2 years ago there were like 5. So all of a sudden, and I think Kubernetes is a big part of this, but the observability allows you to monitor data pipelines. It allows you to monitor all those sources and do so in a dynamic fashion. And I'll throw out one more comment here about another recent show with Oceans, who have built a hyperscale data warehouse. And Chris Gladwin is just a brilliant guy. He said something that was so interesting. He said, basically, you will never have time to look at the raw data anymore in this new world. Things are moving so fast that you have to be looking for patterns of behavior instead of trying to look at individual log files. And that's kind of scary to people. It's kind of scary to me. It's like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But the point he's making is that the scale is so grand, you cannot capture it. You're not going to be able to put your fingers in enough holes in the dike to hold it up. So you need a whole new method of being able to do that. Observability is a big part of that. But Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah, I think anything that ensures data quality from the get-go, instead of trying to think about it after the fact when you've noticed the issues, is really crucial, especially as we know we're going to be working with AI applications that will use larger and larger amounts of data. So LLMs, for instance, the data sets that those are trained on are typically text data sets from the internet. They are incredibly massive. So data quality for that type of data set is not only important, but it's also it's a very large undertaking. So systems that kind of help us vet that process, ensure the data quality, and allow us to put in those guardrails and the guidelines, those privacy and data rights aspects that we are thinking about, and allow us to have systems that we can kind of put some of the automation responsibility on that will, I think, really help us as we start to invest in and see more of those AI technologies and methodologies in practice in organizations.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And, I go back to this concept of loose coupling versus tight coupling, right? I remember from the old service-oriented architecture days. That's how old I am. I remember service-oriented architecture, right? With virtualization or Kubernetes, it's not exactly like that. It's tackling some of the same challenges, but it's not exactly the same thing. But nonetheless, I think Lauren's point earlier about simplicity is really, really important. Document your processes, make it as simple as you possibly can, because the more complex it gets, the more frail it gets, the more hard to understand it gets. All of those problems get worse when it's really complex, right, Lauren?
Absolutely, yes. And documentation, which you touched on, is absolutely key, especially if you are working with a data team, if you're working with people who would like to understand, maybe they're on the product side, maybe they're in leadership, they want to understand what you're doing and why it's impactful. Documentation is oftentimes not just for you and for your team, but it is so others can understand the purpose and the benefit of your solution. And honestly, in that kind of framework as well, help them understand what is capable with AI, with data science. And when they are considering new data sets, when people are mentioning new things to them, they can honestly bring you the use cases and it really starts to empower others on the non-technical side to understand what is possible and what's not, and be better partners to the people on the data side, on the technical side.
Be better partners. That's a really good way to put it too, because this does require teams to collaborate, to work together, to understand the business issue, to understand the data. And I'll just throw one last question over to maybe David and then yourself, Lauren. For these models, you also want to very clearly articulate what you're trying to accomplish with the model. And that needs to be understood by everyone involved. And that's what you track against, right? You say we want to increase customer engagement, for example. We want people to be on our website longer. What can we do to make that happen? And then that's what you monitor and you watch and see. Are we keeping people around longer or not? And when that starts to drift, that's when you have to go to a challenger model or kind of change what you're doing. Real quick, David, what do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely right. You always need to be oriented towards your end goal. I think I mentioned earlier, AI is the implementation detail, and if the model needs to be replaced, it needs to be replaced, right? If you're not meeting your goals, so always keeping in mind those metrics that matter, the task that you're trying to achieve. Those are the things that'll lead you to success with AI, not just trying to play around with a new cool technology.
Yeah, well, folks, look all these folks up online. We do have demos coming up next for our in-studio audience. If you want to be part of the in-studio audience, the virtual audience, hop online to dmradio.biz and sign up for these Zoom webinars. That's how we record these shows. David, I love that comment. AI is an implementation detail. I haven't heard anyone else say that, but it's brilliant because it really does help you understand it's not a silver bullet. It's not magic in a box. It's something that can be used in conjunction with your data, your processes, your people to get stuff done. You have been listening to DM Radio.